right. Hello and good afternoon. My name is James Lothry. I am a technical architect at Demand Chain Systems as well as a Salesforce MVP. And also with me is Dmitry Vinnik, who is a software engineer at Salesforce. And today we're going to be talking about tips and tricks for developing Lightning components, specifically for communities like the Napili template and the customer self-service template. So I'll jump right in here. My first tip of the day is to define a pattern, and this is kind of just a generic tip, right? So the benefit of designing a pattern is that you have a consistent mechanism across your Lightning components and your Apex that your Lightning components use. And what that does, it allows you to define consistent return types and consistent error and exception handling. And then also I can pass in JSON strings for deserializing and serializing values back and forth, which helps out with debugging as well. Also, an important aspect of defining a pattern is that it speeds up the development of my Lightning component. So if I'm developing, say, 10, 20 Lightning components within a particular community, I can ramp those up a lot faster if I have a solid foundation for my Lightning components to go base off of. And then I'm going to kind of show you an example here in the next slide as well. So on the left-hand side is the Apex pattern I like to use. It's a very simplistic Apex class. I have 3 variables in the class, if you can't read it very well. The first one is my JSON response. So it's basically just a string representation of an object that I'm passing back and forth. And then I'm serializing and deserializing it elsewhere. The second variable is an error message. So if I have an exception that happens within my code, I can bubble it up through that variable. And the third one is just a state to tell me whether or not a Lightning component succeeded or failed, so similar to the Aura class that Lightning components come with today. Another thing to note is that in my pattern I have 2 constructors as part of my Apex class. So I have a default constructor, which is the happy path of my Lightning component. It's a successful state. And then the second constructor is for my exceptions that might happen. So I'll pass in an exception into the constructor and then have it handle it accordingly. A cool thing that you can do here actually is if you want to log your exceptions into a custom object in Salesforce, you could easily do that here as well. On the right-hand side is a method that calls that pattern. So I have this MyLightningController class with an Aura-enabled method. That Aura-enabled annotation allows me to call Apex through Lightning components. And then I basically just instantiate the happy path constructor as the first line of my code there. And then I surround all my logic with a try catch. And if I encounter any exceptions, then I use that exception constructor next to handle all my errors. One thing to note is all this code I have in a GitHub repository. So at the end of the slide, there's a link if you want to take a picture of it. All the examples are in there for you to download and use. The second tip I have kind of feeds off of the pattern. So Lightning components actually use kind of an object-oriented principle in terms of they have abstract and interface components that you can use. So my second tip is to use abstract components. They allow you to basically follow the KISS principle, which is keep it simply stupid, or stupidly simple, however you want to look at it. They allow you to reuse lots of your logic. So I can have 6 components that all use the same kind of foundation. I can have my callback handling logic all built into my abstract component. So all the enqueuing action that I have to call through a Lightning component can all be in one place as opposed to 6 or 7 or 20 components. Another thing that an abstract component gives me is consistent error and exception handling again. So I can have for instance, a method that displays a toast message, and it'll pop up that message every time an exception happens. And once again, I just have to define it in one place and just use that throughout my other Lightning components. I can also define utility functions within an abstract component, which is a huge thing if you consider if you have a multiple table kind of Lightning component. So if I have a tabular component that displays opportunities or accounts or whatever, I can define like a sorting method all in one place and have that happen all in just one component as opposed to 2 or more components. So really the abstract components is a really cool feature that you should look into if you're doing any sort of Lightning component development. Again, on the right I have an example of it, but I doubt you can read that by any means. So again, check out the repository on GitHub. The third one is kind of near and dear to a lot of people's hearts here. So I want to give, as a developer, we always want to give the power to the admin. So that's my third tip. And Lightning Components, Community Builder, they have baked-in functionality for this if you dig into it. So the first one is design tokens, and I'll go into these here in a little bit in the next slide. Design attributes as well. And basically, as a Lightning component developer, I want to give admins the ability to take my components and really just kind of drag and drop them in the Community Builder and muck with them and mess with them and not have to come to me every time a minor tweak is needed. So as I mentioned, design tokens are a useful feature to give power to the admin. There are CSS variables or declarations I can use, and there's kind of two types of design tokens. There are standard design tokens and custom ones. The standard ones you can actually kind of use Community Builder with, so I can tweak the color of my community in Community Builder and actually have it impact my Lightning component look and feel as well. So I can change the component from red to blue or the icons from red to blue or whatever, right? And then custom design tokens as well, so I can define a design token bundle, for lack of better words, and have my own CSS declarations where a community designer would just have to come in and tweak my CSS and have it impact the look and feel of my components. On the right-hand side is kind of an example of this. So basically, just use the token with the parentheses to define to use the customer standard design token. And then design attributes are the other facet. So design attributes are basically variables or inputs I can use in my Lightning components. So for instance, I can have text and labels that I have an admin can declare or muck with my Lightning component with. Other useful features for the design attributes include filters. So I can have a list of, say, closed or open opportunities or whatever, and I can allow the admin to pick one or the other. And then component layout. So for instance, in our example, we'll have a grid system that we use in our component, and I can allow the admin to say, hey, I want to display 2 columns versus 1 column or whatever, and allow them to kind of change that look and feel as well. So a very useful feature there to give power to the admin. And again, the whole goal of these two features is to style and configure those components through an administrative way or through Community Builder rather than through code. Now, the next tip is kind of essential, I guess, to Lightning component development. It's basically debugging Lightning components. So you're going to run into issues. There's no ifs, ands, buts about it. So when an issue does arise, you want to start asking those questions like how, what, or why did an error happen? Did an exception occur? And they happen for a variety of reasons. I can have a syntax error, bad data. So for instance, I don't get any records back from my Apex controller that I'm expecting. API version mismatch. So this is kind of an interesting one that I found when playing with abstract components. If my API versions are different between the abstract component versus the concrete component, you'll get a random exception thrown that's not very intuitive. And then controllers, if you've done any sort of Apex or Lightning component development, you've likely run into this. JavaScript controllers cannot have the same method name as the Apex method as well. That will also throw a recursive loop. And then, so kind of some tips on how to diagnose those issues when they do happen. The first one is kind of the equivalent of turning off and on your computer, right? So you basically remove the component from your community and add it back in. And sometimes that'll tell you whether or not exception is happening. So the next one is basically there's a Lightning linter command line interface that you can use, and that'll help you detect any JavaScript errors that happen. Then there's a couple other errors too, like the API versions of the components, as I mentioned. You want to check the method names, so on and so forth. If you find that you can't add the component into your community, you also want to check the interface of your component. Make sure that you have the community interface in the component as well. So just a couple of reasons that you might have issues with your Lightning components and communities. There's a couple tools that I like to use when I do debug the Lightning components. The first one is the developer tools of the internet browser. I'm not talking the developer console. I'm talking like the JavaScript console, basically, in Internet Explorer or Chrome. Those are typically useful because you can set breakpoints in your code. So when your component runs, you can set breakpoints, it'll stop, and you can investigate the state of your JavaScript and your Lightning components. As I mentioned, the Lightning linter, it's a CLI, or it's also built into some of the newer IDEs as well, and that kind of tells you whether your JavaScript syntax is correct. And then Lightning Test Service is kind of a cool feature for unit testing in a continuous development kind of environment. So if you're using pipelines or something like that, you can plug that in to test against your Lightning components. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Dmitry, who's going to give a demo.
Thank you, James.
Yep.
So guys, we looked at the tips and tricks developing communities components, and now we'll try to apply this knowledge into real use case. So let's say your customer sends you email saying the community doesn't work. So as a developer, you go ahead and you try to load the live community, and you see that community technically works. You can actually see the background picture. You can see your logged in user, some of the navigation topics, but there is no content in the middle. So ultimately for the customer, it's useless at this point. So you think that most likely my content component, the custom component I've developed, has some sort of an issue. The first thing you do is you access the code of your custom component and you try to run Lightning linter, the tool that James highlighted in his previous slide, to find if there is a syntax error, because that's the most common errors developers make. And for the sake of time, let's say we ran the tool, and we found that one of the helpers for our custom component featured products has a typo. It has an extra parenthesis. Let's delete that, and now we will save the component. And all it takes is to refresh our live community to see the result. So now we actually, so let me do something here, refresh the builder as well. So now we can actually see the content in the live community. But as you see, there is no contrast between the name of a product and the background. And we would like our customers to actually see what the product is about, not just the price. The price they can see very well. And let me do something here really quick. So let me publish. All right. So to fix the styling, let's actually use the next tip that James highlighted, such as usage of custom tokens that empowers your admin. And to do so, we'll access the style file that we already prepared ahead of time with the custom tokens already created. And at this point, we actually just comment them out to save time, but ultimately, this is what you would actually do. As shown in the slides, you would create your own tokens, and all developer admin has to do is to actually deploy them and mark them to the component you created. So after the changes were made, let's save it again, refresh our community. So now we can actually see the contrast. Don't see the layout changed a bit, so you can actually see one product per line. That's not actually related to my previous change. It's something I prepared ahead of time. But the goal of custom tokens that we just deployed is to see now the contrast between name of a product, Oster Livestock Shears, and the background. So now the customer can actually navigate and choose the product they want. But as you see, we now have to actually scroll down as a customer. So there's only one product per line. It's especially if you were to open it on your phone, it will be very time-consuming to scroll up and down to find the product you want. So the next step is to follow another tip that James highlighted is, again, giving power to your admin. And while we were developing this product component, we exposed a couple attributes that control the grid of the featured product component. So currently, I'm accessing the builder as an admin, not as a developer. I don't work with the dev console anymore. So I go to the builder, I click on my custom component that's been built ahead of time, and I only see these three attributes on the right side. And by just altering this number to, let's say, 5, 6, 6, I'm able to, let it refresh. Yeah. Now I'm able to actually see that the grid has changed. Sorry, I need to refresh this thing. Let's give it a time. Ta-da. So now in the builder, I can actually see the changes being applied. Now I have 5 components. Oh, 6, sorry, that's a different layout. 6 components in a row, so I don't actually have to scroll up and down to select products I want. This is the power of admins that we allow as a component developers, and this is what we encourage you to do. So your admins don't actually have to interact with the code. So at this point, let's republish again, because you changed the attribute, you have to do that. And refresh our community. Okay. So now we actually see the live community with products, with the nice background, but at the same time we can actually see what the product is, along with 6 different products in a single line. So here we demonstrated you just 3 of the tips that James highlighted, such as debugging your component, empowering your admins through custom tokens and attributes that we expose for the custom component. And that's basically the very first steps you can take that will make you a better developer and your customers and admins happier. So to go back to our slides, so on that, I actually would like to quickly cover an important point that many custom component developers forget, is embracing SEO. SEO is a search engine optimization, which in simple terms is basically a set of toolkits that allow you for the content on your community to be searchable online. So if you have a poor SEO, your website will appear on a second page of Google search, and nobody goes to the second page of Google search. So as a developer, it's to some extent your responsibility to make your website more discoverable. And to do that, Salesforce communities provide you with some out-of-the-box tools. One good example is so-called route link component. And we have a small example on the right. Again, as James mentioned, all the code available on GitHub. But what basically this route link component allows you to do is it builds you so-called href, which are basically internally linking between pages on your community. In simple terms, it allows search bots that come in and scan your website to navigate from one page to another. This is important metrics, and it affects your SEO greatly, so I encourage you to utilize or at least look at this component. Another 2 points I want to make is mostly for admins of your community is the content or your page on your website is important. When you make something public, you really have to think about it. There should be no duplicate content. Search engines will put your ranking down if you were to have duplicate content on a page. We need to make sure when you expose content publicly, you really want it to be exposed, because there were cases in the past where there will be, let's say, a case page on your community with 100,000 cases, but you don't actually want it to be publicly available. You make it public, and then all your internal cases showing the links with meaningless information to the web. You want to avoid that. So for admins, you really need to think about SEO, and for component developers, really embrace that. And I encourage you to actually read a couple of Salesforce documents that we came up with that has a lot of information about how to build custom components, the tips and tricks that James outlined. Will also include this SEO documentation. It will help you to get better at development. Another thing we came up with is Community's Trail Mix. It's the core Trailhead courses you might take to actually become a better developer and make your customers happier. And of course, the last but not least is the GitHub link to deploy with DX, and it will also contain this presentation, I believe.
Yep.
And code snippets that were mentioned in these slides. Please take a picture. I will also come back to this slide so you can take a picture afterwards. All right. One more thing I want to make sure you guys also take a note of. There will be more sessions today and tomorrow on the communities and component development. I also encourage you to attend this. But yeah, also you might take a picture. And on that, thank you everyone for listening to us, and we'll take a Q&A right after the session. Thank you.